Okay, so welcome everyone. Good evening. It's good to see everyone. I hope you enjoyed a nice and relaxing holiday break. It's good to see you all, and I know that for myself, I still feel like I'm in 2021, catching up to the reality that it's 2022, and some of you might be feeling the same way. But I'm really happy to introduce to you the Reverend Dr. Nikia Smith Robert. We know each other. We run in the same professional circles, I guess, and we've supported each other from a distance through text notes and emails, and she's just a lovely person. But why don't I go ahead and introduce her, and then we'll get started with our conversation. So our speaker in conversation, as I said, will be the Reverend Dr. Nikia Smith Robert on the guiding question, how does abolition relate to our faith? Dr. Robert is a postdoctoral Child Mellon Fellow in Religious Studies at Pomona College and received her Doctor of Philosophy degree in religion at the Claremont School of Theology. As an interdisciplinary scholar, her research is situated within the fields of religion, ethics, public policy, and critical carceral studies. She uses abolitionist principles and transformative justice strategies to examine religious and social responses to the criminalization of survival and impoverished Black motherhood in the US carceral state. She is also an ordained itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. The founder and executive director of Abolitionist Sanctuary, a nonprofit organization and faith-based abolitionist organization, Dr. Robert helps churches to use public policy and transformative justice strategies to advocate for a more just and equitable society beyond prisons, policing, and punishment. So I'm excited about the conversation that we'll have tonight. We'll be in conversation with Dr. Robert for about 30 minutes, and then we'll spend the rest of our time in breakout groups to have just smaller group discussions. So welcome, Dr. Robert. It's good to see you. So our first question that I given to Nikia was the fact that most people have heard the term abolition with reference to the political movement that sought to put an end to chattel slavery. Can you talk about abolition and what it means in today's context, its history, major figures, and aims? And are there any theological connections between today's movement and the earlier one?
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here and on the call and share this space with you. Thank you for having me. And thank you, Sujeen, for the invitation to talk about abolition from a faith perspective. So, and also thank you for the warm introduction. Prisons are a religious phenomenon. Even if we look back to the first Christian community in antiquity, there was a criminal element, right? Amongst those closest to Jesus. Jesus himself was considered seditious and criminalized. Jesus, who is a brown Palestinian Jew. And Jesus dies a criminal's death, a state-sanctioned execution by the Roman imperials, crucified. It's the scandal of the cross, right? How could we make sense of the Messiah hanging on the cross between two criminals, dying a criminal's death? And in that act, Jesus does something that I think precipitates our understanding of abolition. Jesus extends salvation to the penitent thief. He extends forgiveness. And in that act, Jesus did not see the criminal, but Jesus restored that person into the image of God and said, "Today, you shall be with me in paradise." And so we see an element that's restorative there, that restores the divinity of someone who society had cast away as criminal. And then within Jesus's ministry, we also see signposts for abolition. When Jesus reads from the scroll of Isaiah in Luke 4:18, he announces the inauguration of his earthly ministry. And he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, right? And in that he says, he has called me to speak good news to the poor. And in that he says, to set the captives free. So there's a liberative act there. Jesus's ministry was to set the captives free. Likewise, when we think about Jesus's instructions for discipleship in 1925, Jesus says, as often as you've done it for the least of these, you've done it for me. And in that, one of the requirements are that you visited someone in prison. Go back and read it. Right? So we also see that Jesus is in close proximity to those who are criminal. Jesus himself is criminalized. Jesus gives us instructions to act in solidarity with the least of these, those visit those who are in prison. Jesus extends forgiveness and penitence to a thief and restores him to the Imago Dei. And then finally, the final act of abolition for me in reading about Jesus's life, ministry, and death is that Jesus dies a malefactor, but he resurrects as the Messiah. In other words, Jesus dies a criminal, but he transcends criminality on the cross when he arises as the Messiah. So part of abolition is that resurrection hope of freedom and liberation of the least of these and those who are criminalized. So when I think about the historicity of abolition from a faith perspective, the starting point for me is in the life, ministry, and death of Jesus, and how we connect that to contemporary movements as Christians, as people of faith, is to continue the work of liberation that Jesus started. I know we only have 30 minutes, so I'll stop there and then we could move out at your direction.
Great, thank you. So, so basically, how would you can you just maybe unpack what abolition is calling for in the contemporary movement? Is it a call? I think many of us probably would be on board for restorative justice in terms of people who have been sent to prison. But does it mean the elimination of prisons? Does it mean the elimination of carceral structures? Can you unpack that a little more? I know we're going a little off script, but.
No, please.
Yeah,
I'm fine with the conversation and ebbs and flows. That's fine.
Yeah.
So I think I got this definition from, let me just, I don't know if I could put this in there, but abolitionist futures. And you guys, there's some resources there, and there's others. I didn't have time to include them all. But it says abolition refers to the complete dismantling of, rather than reforming or improving, of the carceral system in the United States, which includes state prisons, a private prison industrial complex that profits from incarceration, a police force and its military infrastructure, a legislative system that responds to the needs of its people primarily by enacting solutions that rely on incarceration, an immigration system whose underlying structure is inextricable from the prison industrial complex, a capitalist economy that operates heavily through the forced labor of incarcerated people, a system of voting and democracy where full citizenship is organized based on who has had contact with the carceral state, and a culture deeply rooted and invested in an ideology of punishment and control, including feminist and progressive thought that relies on carceral logic. In a more concrete sense, abolition means that prisons, both the buildings themselves and the reality of caging human beings, will no longer exist. Police forces as an enforcer of law and order in the name of the state will no longer exist neither. So the abolition has these two components. It's one, dismantling and tearing down the system. And then the other component is building something new that's more restorative and transformative. For me, abolition is captured in this alliteration, to repair harms, to restore relationships, and to rebuild a more just and equitable system. So repair, restore, rebuild.
Okay, great, thank you. That's great. And I guess one other thing that I just wanted to add to the definition and to what you've described is that people who talk about abolition in its contemporary sense, they don't necessarily see a distinction from the earlier movement, in the sense that we are still kind of living in the aftermath and the afterlife of chattel slavery and of its structures and systems, and how the prison system kind of reinforced sort of the realities arising from that. Like, for example, the police forces that were the white police forces who were sort of put into place to capture fugitive enslaved people, for example.
Absolutely. The vagrancy laws, the Black codes, the slave patrol, all of those mechanisms that's happening post-Reconstruction becomes an extended way to another way to extend slavery, right? So you have the institution of slavery, and you have, the Civil War, and then the Reconstruction, where people were, slaves are thriving. And then there's this mechanism that generates, right, that activates, that extends the logic of slavery, right? Sundown towns, any infraction of a former slave, whether it's walking at 8 p.m. when it's dark, right? Whistling in public. Any small infraction would give an excuse to incarcerate, to imprison the slaves, the former slaves.
Right.
Then you see convict leasing as a way to legalize labor, enslaved labor. And all of that becomes remnants of slavery that gives new life to what we now inherit as the carceral state. And the carceral state is deeply rooted in anti-Black racism because of these origins that it perpetuates.
Yeah, thank you. And just your note about sundown towns. I mean, I guess, growing up on the East Coast, I had just thought of that as a phenomenon that was like in the South or on the East Coast. But moving out here, I realized that, we have a history of sundown towns in Orange County and LA County as well. So it's not just, a regional thing. It's kind of across the United States as well. So yeah, thanks for making that note. So given how you've talked about how abolition is both sort of this sort of demolition of the carceral system, of prison systems and of police systems, many, and also restoring and repairing and rebuilding, many people find the ideas of abolition appealing, but then they get nervous when it gets connected to calls to defund the police. They're worried that the absence of a policing structure will lead to mayhem, even if they recognize and condemn police violence and brutality. And I think, for many people, the murder of George Floyd was a wake-up call, especially even though there has been a history of police brutality against Black people. So can you talk a little more about some of those constructive possibilities that abolition offers? And are there any real life examples that you can speak to?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Police and prisons do not make us safer. And Black people in America know that firsthand. And so when we see the atrocities that have happened in Ferguson and other places throughout our country, Minneapolis with George Floyd and so forth, we see, the ways in which not just policing, but even our legal system, right? Even the laws operate in ways to target Black people. Michelle Alexander and her book, The New Jim Crow, talks about sentencing disparity with drug laws, how there's a racial logic that's embedded in our legal system such that Black people are charged more harshly for drug charge related to crack cocaine than cocaine itself, which is a drug that is attributed to white people or more privileged people, right? Because it costs more. And so without saying, right, without the legal system saying we want to punish Black people more heavily, they'll say they legalize this crack that's more associated with Black people and lower class Americans to sentence them more harshly. So you have within our legal system this racialized logic that is kind of underhandedly saying it's, we're colorblind, but this colorblindness is codified in the disparities we see that disproportionately affect people of color. And so this system doesn't make us safer. In fact, it doesn't work, right? We know that when police pull people over with broken window policing, it doesn't necessarily lead to more arrests. And if people are arrested, it doesn't necessarily lead to convictions, right? And when you look at policing in America, increased policing doesn't reduce crime. And then you look at recidivism. If you bring people into the system and they navigate it, and then they come out, they go right back in, right? So it reproduces carcerality. When you look at the cost of incarceration in California, I think it's like close to $70,000+ per person to incarcerate. And the cost to incarcerate is more than the tuition of sending someone to Harvard. So our country invests more in prisons than we do in schools, than we do in the social safety nets and infrastructures we need to make sure that people are thriving.
Right, thank you. And I guess, I was kind of thinking about how we often turn to the police to kind of solve a myriad of problems. So people who might be having mental health issues, they get approached by the police, and often to tragic consequences. We see them kind of being put in places where they don't necessarily need to be. And so I'm wondering if investing in different kinds of infrastructures of support, like more like social work or mental health workers, if that is also part of the shift that needs to be done, not only just turning to the police to solve all of the problems.
Yeah, absolutely. You asked the question and answered it.
Okay.
That's exactly it, right? Abolition requires us to move away from the reliance on prisons and punishment. So you answered that, and I'll just extend it to say, abolition is a way of life. For me, abolition is my religion. And I say that because I believe in a Jesus of liberation, a Jesus who's called to set the captives free. And in following this Jesus, I'm called to extend the ministry of liberation and to advocate for those who are marginalized through various interlocking systems of oppression, but particularly criminality. But I say that because abolition is a way of life. I am an abolitionist as a partner. I am an abolitionist as a parent. And my daughter, she attends an elite private white institution school, and they still have detention at this school. So part of my work as an abolitionist and a parent is to advocate for the abolition of detention at school. I don't think that's a helpful model. I think it's punitive. So as an abolitionist, we have to retrain the ways in which we are conditioned by society to think of punishment as a first response. And how can we imagine alternatives that are restorative and transformative, that reduces harm, right? And so I'll give one more example as a parent. I have 3 children, ages 12, 9, and 5. and the 12 is my daughter, and the 9 is my son. And I'm upstairs, I hear my son say, "I hate you." And so my initial reaction was to scream, call them downstairs, and invoke punishment. And I thought about, if I'm going to live and practice this as an ideology, I have to recondition my response. So what do? I call them downstairs and I say, that caused harm, right? How do we respond to that harm? Well, if you said that you hate your sister, then I think the matching response to that is to show her acts of love throughout the day. Yeah. So for a 9-year-old, that felt like punishment, right? But in fact, it was an alternative to punishment. It was restoration. It restored, it reduced the harm, right? It repaired the harm. It restored relationship. And it was rebuilding a new system in our house that we no longer can think that it's morally right or justified to use the language of hate. And so that will have a much lasting effect in building character and virtue and value than just punishing him and sending him to his room, or punishing someone and sending them to prison.
Thank you. So I guess I'm going to combine a couple of questions here, but I'm wondering if, and this is a bit of a provocative question, but I'm wondering if you think that churches are actually enabling or part of the carceral state? And if so, what are some practical steps that churches can take to promote abolitionist practices within our communities? And maybe just as a final note, can you talk a little bit about the inspiration behind the creation of your own organization, Abolitionist Sanctuary?
Yeah, thank you. It looks like we have 4 minutes. I'll try to take all that time. Yeah. So I'm very, very happy that you answered this question, because I feel like that's the one piece that we haven't yet uncovered, is the ways in which we are complicit in reproducing the carceral state as faith persons. Our complicity relies on the ways in which we look at punishment. And we see how that's embedded in our theology, in our teachings, and our practices. When we look at our notions of sin, right? Sin is this idea that there are people who are bad and there are people who are good. There are people who are undeserving and there are people who are deserving. And that logic is the same logic that we see in public policies, the legal system, and the larger society, that there are some people who are blameworthy, and there are some people who have impunity, right? That are not culpable. We look at the George Zimmerman case with the Stand Your Ground, right? The ways in which we, if you're not familiar with the case, George Zimmerman profiled an unarmed Black boy named Trayvon Martin in Sanford, Florida. He was on his way to get Skittles and iced tea, and on his way back home, he was profiled and ultimately killed by George Zimmerman. George Zimmerman went to trial and was ultimately acquitted, okay? He killed someone and was acquitted. Likewise, in the same state of Sanford, Florida, by the same prosecutor around the same time, invoking the same law of stand your ground, Marissa Alexander, who brandished her weapon at her abuser because she feared for her life, was not acquitted. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison. So it's this idea that Zimmerman was deserving and this Black woman, Marissa Alexander, was not. So this logic of sin, of deserving and undeserving, who's morally justified according to society's imagination, and who's considered deviant, is very much rooted in our logic, in our theologies. Where we have practices of respectability in our churches, right? This idea that women have to dress a certain way, have to be submissive in a certain way. And when women transgress those standards, somehow they're considered promiscuous, licentious, deviant, immoral, bad. So it's the way and I'll just last say in our theology of sacrifice. And we see this a lot in the Black church when we talk about the blood of Jesus and we glorify the cross. That's violence that looks very much like the carceral state, right? Jesus died a criminal's death on the cross. And if we glorify the cross, then we're glorifying somehow this notion of criminality and this violence. We glorify the scapegoating who was a brown Palestinian Jew. We glorify the scapegoating of brown people to the carceral state. So rethinking our theologies in sacrifice, the fact that there has to be a sacrifice to atone, and that sacrifice is disproportionately people who are considered sinful, and those who are considered sinful are disproportionately considered Black and brown. We reproduce it. And so how do we disrupt that? We disrupt that by thinking about more compassionate theologies, more compassionate teachings and practice, teachings that are rooted in grace, forgiveness, reconciliation. And so my organization, Abolitionist Sanctuary, and I'm out of time, looks to train faith leaders in how to use those abolitionist practices with their religious values to end complicity and become courageous advocates for social change in ways that undermines the carceral state and advocates for particularly poor Black mothers who are criminalized. And I could say more about that, but that would take too much time. If you want to learn more about Abolitionist Sanctuary, feel free to reach out to me. It's info@abolitionistsanctuary.com. You can also go to my website at www.nikiasrobert.com, and I can put that in the comment. But ultimately, we want to start a faith-based abolitionist movement that begins with you, begins with the church, it begins with communities. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nikia. I'm wondering, I know we are out of time, but I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind taking a couple of questions if people have them before we go into breakout rooms.
Sure.
Okay, if you want to use the raise hand function, you can go ahead and do that. If there are any questions, and if they're not, then we can just go into the breakout rooms. Okay. All right, we'll take a couple of questions. So Adriana, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. It's been very powerful. I have so many questions, but I think that the only one that I can really ask right now is, I think the most important one for me right now, which is related to your last comment about the theology of sacrifice specifically. And I think the question relates as well to the other things, the issue of sin, and there's something else that you mentioned. I guess not so much the issue of the purity of women. I think that's like in a different category, but with respect to sacrifice, because that's so unique, right? Could you maybe just delve a little bit deeper into how you can reconcile not glorifying essentially what I'm sensing in my spirit is what we are called to glorify in our faith. And I say that completely agreeing with your whole premise of how these theologies are used, and completely agreeing with everything that you've presented in terms of like the history, the systems, the inequality, and the violence. But in terms of just that one point, so I think, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, thank you for asking me to go deeper in this theology of sacrifice and the ways in which our religion is complicit. I will also say, and I'll put this down, but I have an article that talks about this as well in the Harvard Graduate Journal, but Quakers helped to start abolition, but they were also very instrumental in the birth of prisons. And when we get penitentiary, it's rooted in the religious term penitence. And it's this notion that people can go into isolation in solitary confinement and become penitent, reflective of their sins, and ultimately have a change in direction, a change in heart, change in behavior, and be corrected. And so solitary confinement, penitentiary is a religious phenomenon. Even the architecture of the first religious prison, the first prisons were deeply religious. When you see chaplains who escort prisoners down to the death penalty, you see crucifixes in prisons. Like, there is religiosity all throughout the prison system. And with sacrifice, so if I were to go deeply into the theology, I would look at Anselm of Canterbury. And Anselm has this theology of salvation that is based on a feudal cosmology, right? That this notion of serfs and lords, and the lords are the upper echelon and the serfs are at the bottom. And in order for society to be restored, there has to be a sacrifice, which means we have to sacrifice the serfs, the lower class people, in order to restore the honor of an offended lord who's up here at the top. And so so that's how salvation works, that Jesus is the perfect sacrifice. And so there has to be a sacrifice to restore the honor of this offended Lord. And that's what we see in society. We see that there's an elite class of people, the 1%, who are the lords in this feudal economy. And then there's the serfs, who are often Black and brown people, who are sacrificed or scapegoated for the sins of society, to restore the honor of these privileged people. And so that religious logic translates from our doctrine to what we see in the carceral state. And so ways that we could recondition ourselves away from salvation. Salvation is a violent act, right? Jesus dies on the cross for our sins. That's violent. Salvation shouldn't require death, right? Our well-being shouldn't require that someone has to die for us. It certainly shouldn't require that Black and brown people have to die. So what womanists and feminists theologians do is, rather than focus on the death of Jesus that's connected to the cross, we look at the life and ministry of Jesus. What can we glean from Jesus's life and ministry that gives us life-generating possibilities that's not rooted in violence and death? And what we find, what Dolores Williams says, is that there's a ministerial vision, right? When we focus on Jesus's healing and miracles, that sounds salvific. When we focus on how Jesus helps people, those who are marginalized and outcasted, that sounds salvific. That sounds like something that we could apply to society in transformative ways. But if we hang on only to the death and the cross, then that could be used to justify the carceral state that is also killing people in the honor of restoring public safety, in the honor of restoring an elite people who feel that they need to be protected, right? So that's how we have to map out, how I suggest that we think about the ways our theologies rooted in salvation can be harmful and reproduce carceral logic.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
We'll have just one more question from Bettina, and then we'll go into breakout rooms. Go ahead, Bettina.
Thanks, Eugene. And thank you, Dr. Robert. So my question is really around how we separate systems from individuals when we think about abolition, right? So I've done work in abolition in the realm of education, right? Because that's the way that I work through, right? But I'm also an educator, right? And so when we think about individuals who are part of unjust systems, and then we think towards abolition, how do we hold the humanization, right, of people who in their hearts are pursuing, let's say, law enforcement, teaching, right? Like all of these systems that have become very carceral, right? But I think the individuals who go into these systems did not come into them in order to harm others, right? And so how do we, not necessarily, not all of them, right? But then they get caught up in unjust systems. And so how do we, I think as Christians, as people, as abolitionists, hold and balance, right? The humanity of folks who are caught up in unjust carceral systems with the fact that we really want to engage in harm reduction, that we really want to repair, restore, rebuild. And how do we disentangle those things when we begin to have these conversations? Because it feels often so overwhelming. And we think about, oh, the people that we know that are police officers, that are educators, that are, and these are good individual humans. So then how do we then advocate for abolition in the face of that, or begin to have those conversations with folks who feel like, what a radical concept to really believe in this? So I would love your insight on that.
Yes, thank you. So that, I've gotten that question before, and I'm just going to be brutally honest. It was good white Christians who left church on Sunday service and attended lynching spectacles and participated in the lynching of Black people. And there are good people who are police officers and service people, but who are nonetheless participating in a system that is unjust and killing innocent people because of anti-Black racism and other biases. So we have a responsibility to disrupt our complicity and participation in those systems by no longer being a part of them, and thinking, how can we work together to imagine a new system? So I know we're short in time, but that would be my short answer. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I guess, there's so much that we can unpack and we can keep going, but I'm hoping that this gives you a better sense of how to make these connections. And we are going to go into, I want to thank Dr. Robert for her time. You're welcome to stay on the call, but at this point, we'll be going into breakout rooms with a couple of questions, just to be in conversation with each other about what we've talked about tonight. So I'm going to place these questions. Yes, go ahead.
Say a final word.
Yeah, sure.
I just want to thank you all for having me. And my email is there if you have any lingering questions and want to learn more about Abolitionist Sanctuary. And I wish you all the best. Please be encouraged and be reminded that the God we serve is a God of liberation. And we are called to follow in the footsteps of those who are pioneers and moving us toward freedom. So thank you.
Yeah.